and welcome to the channel. In today's session, we will be focusing on Kubernetes pods. We will try to cover all important aspects of a Kubernetes pod in this session. So let's get started. We will be starting with the question, what is a Kubernetes pod? A Kubernetes pod is a Kubernetes pod is a logical collection of containers. We can go by this definition as well, okay? Or a Kubernetes pod is the smallest deployment that we can make in Kubernetes. So this is an example of a pod. So typically a pod, we can consider this as a pod. So typically a pod can have container. Typically a pod can have container. So in this example we have one pod, and inside one pod there is one container we can see, and the application will be running inside this container. This is also possible, and this is also possible. We can have a pod, and in this pod we can have two containers as well. So practically, can a pod have two containers? Yes. So let's take an example. The name of this pod is my pod, and this pod can have container C1 and it can have container C2. So we can have multiple containers running inside a pod. Multiple containers can run inside a Kubernetes pod. Now the question comes in ki how many pods we can run? So we can run multiple pods. There is no fixed answer to that, but what I have seen is like 5 or 6 container running inside a particular pod. Now how we can create a pod in Kubernetes? Now the question comes here is ki how can we create a pod in Kubernetes? Okay, how can we create a pod in Kubernetes? So first of all, pod is a resource. Pod is a Kubernetes resource. Pod is a Kubernetes resource. And if you want to create a pod in Kubernetes, you can create it via two methods. One is called as imperative method. And another is called as declarative method. So anyone can create a pod in Kubernetes. Either he has to use imperative method or he has to use a declarative method. What is imperative method? So you can write one line command and you can create a pod. That is basically called as imperative method of creating a resource. So what is one line command? kubectl run my pod - image equals to nginx. So we can execute this particular command, and this particular command helps you to get a pod with one container, and the name of the container will be the image inside the container that will be running as nginx. What we can do is we can write a manifest in Kubernetes. We can write a YAML manifest in Kubernetes, and we can create a pod as well. So how can we write a manifest in Kubernetes? So basically we can write it goes like this: API version something v1 pod. Then we can have kind :pod metadata name. Then we have to give indentation of 2 spaces. Name would be my pod, Okay, and then we have to specify spec, and here in spec we have to specify container. We have to give the name of the container. So name of the container can be Nginx container. Okay, Nginx container, and then you have to specify the image. So image can be Nginx. You can specify the version, or you can put it latest. Okay, and if you want to specify the port number, you can specify the port of the container port as well, so where it will be listening, something like this. So if anybody wants to create a pod in Kubernetes, you can create a pod in Kubernetes using two methods. One is imperative method, or one is called as declarative method. You can have inside one pod you can have one container, or inside a pod you can have two container, and the containerized application will be running inside these containers. Okay, this is how we can understand like this. Now going forward, there are different types of containers can be possible. There can be different types of pods. So what are the different type of pods? Let's understand like this. So one is called as single pod. One is called as single pod. What does exactly means? It means a pod, single pod, a pod having one container running one container. A pod can be running one container, and inside this the containerized application, either it can be Nginx, it can be any application, it can be any of your Java application or .NET application. Any application would be running inside this container. Okay, we have done multi-container. So what this multi-container means? Multi-container means a pod where more than two containers run. So if you have C1, C2, C3 containers running inside a pod, this kind of definition, this kind of structure, this kind of concept is called as multi-container. If you want to specify, if you want to create a multi-container, you can write a Kubernetes declarative manifest. You can write a manifest, and inside this manifest you can specify. So so in the specification you have to specify container, and then you have to specify the name. So the name can be C1, and you have to specify the image that this C1 will use. So let's suppose it is going to use Nginx :1.21, and then you have to specify name :C2, and you have to specify the image, that is Nginx 1.22, and here you have to specify name C3. Image it will be using is Nginx :1.23. So this is a manifest of a multi-container pod. Now according to the need, we can have another type of container as well. So there is something called as there is a type of pod. So a pod can be of single pod or a single container pod. Single container pod would be better to specify. So there are different type of pods we can create in Kubernetes. One is single container pod, then we can create multi-container pod. Then we can create something called as sidecar container pod. Okay, how sidecar container pod will look like? So this will be a pod, and there will be a container, and this will be kind of main application. So this will be main application, and there will be a container which runs parallelly here. So there is one more container. So we call this container as sidecar container. We will cover the sidecar container in detail in the next videos. Okay, and then there will be one more type of pod, that is called as init container pod. So let's understand init container pod in very simple terms. So how does a init container pod look like? So there will be a pod. Inside this pod there will be a container where your main application will be running, and then there will be a pod which will be called as init pod, and this init pod this init container basically, sorry, so this init container will be responsible for doing the initialization work, and it will get completed, and then the main application will start. So in another lectures we will cover about sidecar container, init container, and multi-container in detail. Okay, now let's see how we can create a container. So I have a Kubernetes cluster over here. So let me see, kubectl get nodes. So I have a cluster of 2 nodes, and this particular cluster is version 1.27.2 of Kubernetes. Here I am going to show you how to create a pod. Kubectl get kubectl run mypod hyphen imp using imperative method. So this is the name of the pod, and this pod will be using the image image equals to nginx colon 1.21. So if you are going to run this particular command, what will happen? A pod will get created. You can see a pod got created. Let's take a look to the pod. Kubectl get pod. You can see a pod is created and the status of the pod is running. Now here you can see one by one. What exactly it means? It means this particular pod having one container, and that one container is up and running. That is why the status of the pod is showing running. Okay, now this is called as imperative method. I will show you how to create a pod using declarative method as well. I have a manifest written over here. So this particular manifest is written in YAML, guys. So it starts with API version v1, kind pod, metadata. We have to specify the name of the pod. In the spec we have specified only one container, and the name of the container is going to be nginx container, and this container will be running the image nginx 1.21, and here we will be specifying the port number. So application in the container will run on this particular port, that is 8080. Now how to create using declarative method? Kubectl apply, or we can go with kubectl create hyphen f and my pod.yaml. So you have to specify the name of the file. Once you do this, what will happen? A pod will get created. Kubectl get pod. Now if you hit enter, you will see a pod has been created with imperative method. A pod has been created using declarative method. So ideally there is no difference. You are creating a Kubernetes resource, but there are two methods that you are using. Okay, now if you want to if you want to know more about any pod, what you can do, you can describe kubectl describe pod. Take the name of this pod. Okay, so my pod, hit enter. So once you will hit enter, what it will happen is it is going to show you the detailed status of this particular pod. So the name of the pod is my pod here, kubectl describe pod, and here the name is my pod. So here it is giving you the name of the pod, namespace, where it is running. It is giving you the container which is running. So this pod is running the container my pod imp, and then container id, image, from where by default all the images will be pulled from the Docker Hub. So all the images, this particular image has been downloaded from docker.io, and this is what the entire events of the pods basically. A pod can go into any another state. What does it means? Let me show you to you. Kubectl get pod. If you do here, you will see these pods are running. Now one more very important point is if you delete this particular pod, kubectl delete pod, if you delete any pod in Kubernetes, what will happen? The pod will not get recreated by itself because it is not managed by any of the replication or deployment controllers. So pods are ephemeral, and they will once you delete, they will get deleted unless until they are not managed by any of the controllers. Okay, now so this is what we have in this particular session. Thank you, and please do like and subscribe, support me in growing my channel. Thank you. If you have any questions with respect to Kubernetes pod, feel free to connect with me, and in upcoming videos we will be talking about sidecar containers and init containers in detail. That's it. Thank you.